Check, check, mic check. Check, check, mic check. Welcome to Podcast Envy. I'm your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder, and today is part 2 of what I started last time. Last time it was, is your podcast boring? And today, dun, 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 how to make your podcast entertaining. You want to know the secret? All you have to do is add a dun, 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 and that automatically makes it more entertaining. No, seriously, that would be weird in a lot of podcasts. So I wanted to start out first by saying, why do we need to make it more entertaining? You know, the thing about this topic is a lot of people don't know that they need this. So the fact that you're listening right now and you haven't tuned out, the fact that you even clicked play to begin with is good on you, because it is a topic that is so important to audience development, which is about developing your podcast as a show. It is a show. Shows should be entertaining, even if they are educational. So going back to the last episode that I released here, Is Your Podcast Boring? We talked about how the research shows that the top 2 reasons why a human would listen to a podcast are 1, to learn something new, and 2, to be entertained. And so the best strategy is to do both of those things. So you can tap into both of those top 2 reasons why someone might listen to your podcast, to learn something new and to be entertained. So now we need to talk about the entertaining part, because I think most podcasters, most of the ones that I am in community with and that I work with are pretty good at the learn something new part. I don't really need to tell them how to do that. I don't need to tell you how to do that. You know how to teach someone something new. But the entertainment part is actually sometimes, for a lot of us, the more challenging part. So why are we talking about this at all, besides, all that wacky research stuff? Paul Reilly is one of our clients at the Creative Imposter Studios, and his show is all about the top questions that salespeople do and don't ask, but probably should. And it is probably responsible for most of what I know about sales and definitely has helped me in my business. But that is neither here nor there. As I was listening to a recent edit of his episode, What Separates Top Achieving Salespeople, something caught my ear and I thought you should hear it. So in the clip, what Paul is saying in answer to this question, what separates top achieving salespeople? One of the tips that he had is that for some reason, there's a trend right now in the sales world that some so-called experts are claiming that relationship selling is dead, that it's over. In the days of Amazon, nobody really needs a relationship with Amazon or anyone at Amazon in order to buy from Amazon, right? Whatever. However, Paul says that in research conducted by his company, I'm super into the research lately, aren't I? In research that Paul conducted with his company for value-added selling,
top achievers in our study indicated that 79% of their sales success is attributed to the customer relationships that they build. In a separate study, we asked a group of procurement-type buyers and other decision makers, why would you choose one partner over another? And in both cases, relationship with a salesperson ranked higher, meaning more important than price. Relationship selling is critical. Now, relationship selling in many ways is just focusing purely on the customer. It's about making their lives easier. It's about making them look like a hero, coming through for them, delivering on what you promise. Relationship selling is more than just showing up and bringing a box of donuts. Entertainment is critical. In fact, entertainment is one of the primary ways top achievers build that relationship.
Okay. At this point, you're like, but Andrea, I'm not selling anything when I'm making a podcast. What does this have to do with anything? Wrong. You are always selling when you are making a podcast, whether you are conscious of it or not. So yes, on the surface level, you may be making your podcast in order to find new people to buy your product, your service, join your membership, come to your event, whatever it is. That's like the obvious top level selling that you may be doing. And even if you are recording or having a conversation with someone in that moment, maybe that's not top of mind and it doesn't necessarily need to be, but ultimately the podcast exists because of a call to action, because of a thing that you want your audience to do. Take that away. And even if you are not trying to move them towards a buying decision about any of those things, you could be using your podcast to sell them on an idea, a concept, a change that you want to see. Most of the podcasters that we work with at the Creative Imposter Studios are purpose-driven podcasters, which means that in whatever niche they happen to be in, or whatever industry or whatever sector, they see something that is status quo that they think could be better, that they would like to see change, that they would like for people to do differently. They would like different outcomes. They would like a better experience for their audience. And so you could be selling people on that big idea, on that concept, on that change that you want to see. And then on an even deeper level, and maybe more obvious, but less obvious that we don't always think about, is that you are selling them on continuing to spend their time and attention listening to your podcast, because they could skip forward at any moment. They could skip to the next episode or a different show, or just stop listening to podcasts altogether at any given moment. So you want to give them a reason to keep listening all the way through to the end and to be so excited when the next episode pops up in their queue, in their app. So yes, you are always selling when you are making a podcast. So cool. You want to entertain your listeners, i.e. your clients, i.e. your prospects, whoever it is that is tuning into your show. You want to entertain them. So how are we going to do that? Are we going to take our listeners out to a sporting event or a live theater show? Is that how we're going to entertain them? Are we going to tap dance and do jazz hands? Okay, no, we're not going to do any of those things. Of course not. We are going to make our content compelling and entertaining. And I am going to give you my top 10 favorite ways that podcasters are successfully doing this in just a moment. But first, it's time for our Podcast Angel segment. Podcast angels are those companies, products, services, etc., who I know are going to make your podcasting experience so much more effective and enjoyable and entertaining. Maybe. The first podcast angel that I would like to share with you is She Podcasts Live 2023. It is coming up in Washington, D.C., June 19 through 22. And I'm going to be there. I mean, you probably should be too, so that we can meet in person and hang out and talk about podcasting. And if you haven't gotten your ticket yet, never fear. I have a promo code for you to save $50 off your ticket. And then you can come to my session. Want to know what that promo code is? Join me, all one word, for She Podcasts Live 2023. I would love to see you there. My session, I just confirmed, is Be the Star of Your Show. Oh, funny how we're talking about not having a boring podcast and how to entertain people through your podcast, when my session coming up in DC is going to be the Star of Your Show. I mean, it all goes together, doesn't it? So if you want to come hang out with me, be part of that workshop, find out how you can be the star of your show in a good way, not an obnoxious way, I would love to see you there at She Podcasts Live. And no, I get no kickback from having you use that promo code. However, it will make my conference experience so much more better to meet you there. So, more better. There you go. Also, the other podcast angel that I would like to share with you today is me. I am my own podcast angel. The Podcast Envy Refresh is a brand new service that I am offering through the Creative Imposter Studios. And if you are worried that your show might be boring, or you want to know how to make your show more entertaining or more effective, or find out what opportunities you may be missing out on in the podcasting space, the Podcast Envy Refresh is for you. It is so brand spanking new that I don't even have a sales page for it at the time that I'm recording this. But the best way to find out if the Podcast Envy Refresh is for you is to book a virtual tea date with me. The URL for that tea date is thecreativeimposter.com/tea for 20. That's TEA, like the delicious hot beverage that you sip, for FOR 20, thecreativeimposter.com/tea for 20. And let me know that what you are interested in talking about is the Podcast Envy Refresh. And what is that? Basically, you and I will sit down, we'll talk in depth about your show, your goals, your audience, your dreams, your vision, and anything that feels stuck. And then I am going to do a deep dive into your show, into your website, into your socials, all the things, and come back to you with some recommendations and action items so that you have an actual plan of what to focus on next to continue to grow your show. That's the Podcast Envy Refresh. And with all of that podcast angel goodness, let's come back to my top 10 favorite ways to make your podcast entertaining. All right, here it is. The suspense is killing you, isn't it? The number one way to make, well, this isn't number one, like they're not in any particular order. Okay. There, that's that. Make it seem like I'm giving you number one right at the top. No, these are in no particular order. The first thing I have on my list is storytelling. Storytelling, framing things in the form of a story, is one way to make your podcast entertaining. And you may say, I'm not a fiction writer, Andrea. How am I supposed to tell a story? Storytelling can be as simple as talking about something that happened in your life. Please don't make it banter and talking about your life for the sake of banter and talking about your life. Please make it relevant. Make it relevant to your listener. Make it relevant to the topic that you are talking about. And I am going to give you some examples of this. Encounter Culture is a podcast produced by us for the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs. And it is primarily an interview-based show with guests talking about a particular thing. And of course, we do our best to pull stories out of those guests. But what I want to really point to in terms of how we make this show entertaining is that in the introductions for the episodes, our host, Charlotte, does an amazing job of writing a little story for you, perspective from her own life, an experience that she had that really brings you into the context in New Mexico for the thing that we are about to talk about with the guests. So I can't really describe it any better than that. All I can say is go listen to Encounter Culture and pay specific attention to how we use those stories from Charlotte in the intro for the episode to lead you into the episode interview itself. Also, the Q&A sales podcast with Paul Reilly, the one that I was just talking about for relationship selling and entertaining as part of building that relationship with your audience in this case. Even though his episodes are pretty short, they're usually somewhere between like 8 and 15 minutes long. And he's giving you tips. He's giving you how to. It is not a long form narrative show. However, Paul will infuse his episodes with anecdotes and real life examples, either someone that he was talking to in a training or a buddy of his or something that one of his daughters said. He'll weave these short little stories and anecdotes into the context of what he's talking about. So that's storytelling. Also, humor. Humor is a great way to make your podcast entertaining. And if you have been listening to Podcast Envy at all, then you know that this is one of my top favorite ways that I love to make Podcast Envy entertaining. I have listened to in the past and continue to listen to quite a few podcasts about podcasting. Some are created by my colleagues and my friends. And honestly, some are more entertaining than others. For example, I love the podcast Editor's Mastermind. I love listening to that show because of a lot of different reasons, but one of the reasons is because the co-hosts bring humor into the topics of conversation. It's not so serious and it's not dry. A lot of podcasts about podcasting are so dry, and you may learn something amazing from them, but it's just not fun to listen to. So we've got storytelling, we've got humor. On the flip side of that, vulnerability, intimacy, and disclosure. This may seem like, is vulnerability entertaining? Yes. We eat it up when the people that we are following are vulnerable with us. When somebody shares an intimate story, and I don't necessarily mean intimate like sexy, I just mean intimate in deeply personal. One example of this is Conversations with a Wounded Healer. This is by our client, Sarah Bueno, and it is a mental health, social justice, and therapeutic profession podcast. It's about healing for healers. And she will be very authentic and vulnerable in sharing about certain experiences that she herself has had. Because even though she has a body of expertise, and even though she is there as a mentor and a guide, part of Sarah's entire platform and her entire brand is humanizing mental health professionals, humanizing therapists. Therapists don't necessarily have all their stuff together, right? Therapists are people too. Therapists have struggles too. Therapists are dealing with trauma too. And that is part of her whole brand. And not only does Sarah disclose at a high level, she creates through her interviews a safe, supportive container for her guests to do that as well. Also, another show, Wild and Sublime with Karen Yates. Wild and Sublime is all about sex and intimacy and relationships. Karen is a somatic sex educator, and obviously that topic just wham, right there. It's obviously an intimate topic. And Karen has been consciously infusing more of her own personality and her own storytelling into these episodes as the show has been growing. And you're going to hear more about that in the next episode of Podcast Envy, which is actually taken from a masterclass that Karen and I recently did together about hosting skills. So you're going to hear a ton more from Karen in the future. Number 4, emotions. So this is kind of related to that last one. This is something that when I'm working with my high school students, so I have a high school podcast mentoring program in Chicago called Power Your Story through an organization called After School Matters. And we are constantly talking about how to tell stories. They love the how-to stuff. They love giving their opinions about things. And they get the idea of a story having a beginning, middle, and end. They get that there are characters. They get that there's a setting. And they get that there's a plot. There is a sequence of things that happen. And in most cases, they get that there needs to be a conflict or a challenge or a problem, and that there needs to be some kind of resolution. So super easy frameworks to teach. Where the spiciness comes in telling your stories is in emotions. It's how did the character feel? If you're telling a story about yourself, how did you feel? And let's get a little bit more specific. Let's not say I felt sad, but let's talk about what that feeling of sadness was. Let's use visual, sensory, descriptive language that activates the listener's imagination and puts them in that experience with you. In addition to emotions, I'm going to add on tension, because tension or conflict will generally drive those emotions. So, leaving space in your episodes for emotions, even if what you have is primarily a teaching or educational or informational podcast, coloring it, adding that spice into it through emotions can help make the content more entertaining. The podcast client who I want to shout out for using emotion in our storytelling is the Santa Fe Opera. And we produce a podcast with them called Key Change. Opera, emotions. Oh my gosh. Opera is like the greatest stage for emotional storytelling. Opera is all about the height of these dramatic emotions. And what we're talking about in that podcast, there's a lot of difficult topics going back to that idea of tension. We're addressing American storytelling in the opera world, and how do we tell these stories that are uniquely American, and who are the voices that have been historically disenfranchised and disincluded and shut out from the world of opera, and how are we bringing those many worlds together. We are creating a container through that podcast that really has allowed for a lot of folks to really explore how different parts of history and American culture affect them. And there are some very emotional episodes that have come out this season, particularly the episodes around This Little Light of Mine, which is an opera that was written inspired by the life of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was a voting rights activist. Voting rights, politics, slavery, racism, civil rights and justice. Like there's a lot of big topics and there's a lot of emotional storytelling. So all of these episodes and shows that I'm referencing, of course, I'm going to be putting links in the show notes for this episode in the description in your app and at podcastenvy.com. Now, I kind of just rolled two things into one, which was I was going to make visual sensory language a separate line item than emotions, but it kind of goes together, right? So infusing your storytelling, infusing your episodes with emotions, but then more specifically, using that sensory language. It's an audio medium, but that doesn't mean that you can't activate your listener's imagination by describing the way that something looked, the way that it smelled, the way that it tasted, the way that it felt. You know, they say that psychologically, reading something scary is scarier than watching a scary movie or TV show. And the reason why they say whoever they say that is because when you read something scary, you are activating a certain part of your brain that is filling in the gaps. It is only getting a limited amount of information on the page, and that information, if well written, is activating things in your mind. Your mind is imagining what it looked like, what it sounded like. Whereas if you're watching the movie is telling you what it looks like. It's telling you what it sounds like, right? Your brain doesn't have to fill in those gaps. But if you can ignite that part of your listener's brain and let their brain fill in some of those details and start to imagine the world that you are creating through your language, this is going to make it so much more stimulating for their brain. And you might have a scarier podcast. I've been thinking a lot more intentionally about social media lately. Like most of us, it's kind of a love-hate relationship, but I'm feeling a teensy bit more experimental because of all the time I've been spending with Lauren Ramsey of Betsy Bash, my favorite social media and digital marketing agency. Lauren and I recently created an integrated podcast and social strategy service called The Creative Bash for podcasters like you who feel like you're spinning your wheels, not growing your show fast enough or consistently enough or sustainably enough, or you recognize that you're simply not getting the engagement and interaction that you want from your audience. You know they're there in theory, but sometimes you feel like you're shouting or podcasting, as it were, into the void. Over the next few episodes of Podcast Envy, you'll hear a brand new segment called the Creative Bash Starter, a quick tip or insight from Lauren and me, mostly Lauren, let's be honest, on aligning your content strategy between channels for a better overall experience. Once you've had a taste and you're ready to see the full menu, head to the show notes for a link to a quick interest form to request an invitation for a Creative Bash virtual tea with Lauren and me. We'll hang out together online for about 20 minutes and see if the Creative Bash is a good fit for you and your amazing show. Hey, Lauren from Betsy Bash.
Hello.
Something that you offer in your social media services is called social selling. And when I first heard of this, I was like, what is that? Spamming people on LinkedIn? Tell me more.
Yes, definitely. So it started with community management as like a broad term. You've got all these people in your community, right? They're either following you or you're following them or you're engaging with each other. Then you want to start engaging with that community one-on-one, not just posting, right? And this is a very, very fundamental social media principle, is it cannot only be one way. If you're doing that, you're doing it wrong, because it's not a soapbox. It's not a place for you to just shout into the void. It's a place for you to share and receive back. So you want to be engaging with people one-to-one, either in comments or in DMs or in stories, depending on the platform. But it doesn't have to be spammy and it doesn't have to be inauthentic, right? So let's say you have a podcast about crafting. There's tons of people on Instagram, tons of people on TikTok talking about crafting. So you could list out a bunch of hashtags that you think your audience would be searching and posting content with that hashtag. And then you go into Instagram or you go into TikTok and you start pulling up those hashtags, looking through the posts that are inside those hashtags and making conversations, right? Authentic conversations. So if you see somebody crafting with a cricket and you're like, oh my gosh, I love crickets. I've had mine for this many long years and I make so many things. Like, what's your favorite thing to make with yours? So you're not just saying, hey, listen to my podcast. It looks like you like to craft.
No.
Don't do that. So social selling has its roots in community management, but social selling does take it a little bit further because it has that selling component. So what you want to do is build and nurture a relationship through community management until you can do the next step, which is, I don't know if you're into podcasts, but I have a crafting podcast and I was actually talking about that same exact thing last week and I'd love to hear what you think, right? That seems authentic after you've built the relationship. But just jumping right in and saying, hey, do this for me, that's not going to work.
Going back on my list. So we've got storytelling, humor, vulnerability, intimacy and disclosure, emotions and tension, visual and sensory, language that activates the listener's imagination. Number 6, trending topics, hot takes, unpopular opinions, or subverting expectations. Ooh, this is such a good one. This is a content and format one. You know, I love doing the hot takes and unpopular opinions on things. The next one, number 7, recurring touch points, themes, or segments. So segments are where you have little parts of the show. For example, Podcast Envy, the Podcast Angel is a segment. It is in every episode. It has a little music bumper on each end of it. And it is something where I'm going to talk about a product or service or company or provider who is going to help you in your podcasting journey. A segment could also be an intro to an episode. A segment could also be listener of the month where we pull a review or something like that. A segment could be a review of something. There's so many different ways that you can do that. A recurring theme or a recurring touch point is a little more subtle than that. So in the podcast that I was talking about with the Santa Fe Opera Key Change, we have some recurring touch points in that series. They don't always come up in every single episode, and we don't always or ever plan for them, but they're things that sort of came up in the early stages of the podcast that we bring back every once in a while. So for one thing, we have something that we call the Key Change Time Machine, because in the way that we're doing the storytelling on that podcast, we're jumping around in timelines. Like this happened in 2019, and then this is planned for 2024. And then we're telling a story that happened in 19 whatever. So we're often jumping around in the timeline. And so we kind of came up with this device of the Key Change Time Machine. And so every time we're about to make a big jump in time or reference something from the past, we'll say, oh, it's time to get in the Key Change Time Machine. And I even at some point started using this same recurring little clip of music to indicate the time machine. And so that is a recurring touch point. Another one that we use in that show is waving a magic wand, which is, something that so we're talking a lot about changing things and idealism and what we'd like to see for the future. And so a lot of times the host, Andrea Fellows Feinberg, will be asking if we could wave a magic wand. And so I have a little magic wand sound effect that goes with that as well. It's just little bits of touch points that feel familiar to listeners, so that every time they listen to an episode, they're like, oh, I remember the magic wand sound, or, oh, it's the time machine again. It sounds corny when I say it like that, but they're just not quite like an inside joke, but almost like an inside joke where it's like, I recognize that it feels familiar to me, and that is comforting and entertaining. Also leading into that. So I guess these are kind of in a certain order because they all kind of lead into each other. Audio texture is a thing that makes your podcast more entertaining. Audio texture can be anything from music to ambient sound to intentional sound design, sound effects. Audio texture can also be the way that you, as the host, use your voice as an instrument. So, one of the trainings that I've done at a lot of podcast conferences is about using your voice. And this is changing the rhythm of how you're speaking, getting a little louder, getting a little softer, leaving more space and pausing, or talking really fast, or going higher in my voice, or going lower in my voice. There's all these different ways that you can add texture to the listening experience that your listener is having. And the more ways that you can vary that texture and make it a rich experience, just purely from an audio perspective, the more your listener is going to be tuned in rather than tuned out. I got two more for you. Can we do it? Can we get through this whole list? Number 9, help your listeners see themselves in the content that you're creating. You can do this in so many different ways. You can do this by taking listener questions or having listeners leave audio feedback. You can do this by bringing your audience in for an interview or for a recording or a conversation. You can give relevant examples that apply directly to your listener. You can speak in such a way that it makes it feel like they're in the room with you and that you're seeing them and you're reacting to them and you're responding to them. And it feels conversational, even though it's just you recording on a microphone and it's not you talking at them, or worse yet, having a conversation with somebody else that completely has nothing to do with them. So finding these little ways to help your listeners see themselves in the content that you're creating. This goes back to putting the emphasis on your listener, making sure that you know who your listener is, where they are in their life or in their business or in their career or in the experience of whatever it is that you're talking with them about, and meeting them there, meeting them where they are, knowing what's going to be relevant for them and being able to speak directly to that. And then number 10, my 10th and final way to make your podcast entertaining is gamification and interaction. How do you gamify a podcast? Interesting. 20,000 Hertz with Dallas Taylor is a fantastic podcast all about the world of sound and audio. And he has a segment. See how some of these start to overlap? He has a segment on 20,000 Hertz called The Mystery Sound, and it's always somewhere in the middle of the episode, usually around an ad break, and he will play a sound with no context, and then you, as the listener, can write in and say what you think that sound is. And if you're right, you get entered into a drawing to win a t-shirt. Like a t-shirt, cool. But the point is, I almost never know what the mystery sound is. And I just love playing along with that. And then obviously on the next episode, they reveal what the last mystery sound was and congratulate whoever got it right and won the t-shirt. Another way of gamification is a show that no longer is being produced, which makes me very sad, but you can go back and listen to past episodes and you will be very entertained. This is Flash Forward with Rose Eveleth. And in Flash Forward, Rose used to always say, if you spotted the hidden reference in this episode, let us know. And I was like, hidden reference. Like, I always wondered what that was. And it created this sense of mystery. And I never quite figured it out. So I actually dug around. And here is Rose's example of what these references were. And man, you got to go deep to figure these out. So for example, in episode 11, which was called Winded, the premise was, what would happen if a company put up so many wind turbines that they actually changed the climate on Earth? I know this sounds totally crazy, but I swear to you, this is something that scientists have actually looked into. So naturally, I talked to one of those scientists. So that was what the episode was about. And the hidden reference in that episode was that the company that makes the wind turbines, so this is, I think, there's a fictional part of the episode and then a truth part of the episode. So I think that's in the fictional storytelling. The company that makes the wind turbines is named Vayutech, after Vayu, the Hindu lord of the winds. So that was the reference, is that the name of the company, Vayutech, was based off of Vayu, the Hindu lord of the winds. So that is an example of the hidden reference in the episode, total gamification that gets your mind like activated and looking for the hidden reference. You can also create ways that listeners can interact with you through reading podcast reviews, having them use certain hashtags on social media, or having them leave voicemail or send you emails that you then incorporate into the show in some way, shape, or form. So that's my full list: storytelling, humor, vulnerability, intimacy, and disclosure, emotions and tension, visual and sensory language that activates the listener's imagination, trending topics, hot takes, unpopular opinions, or subverting expectations, recurring touch points, themes, or segments, audio texture, helping your listeners see themselves in your content, gamifications, and offering ways to interact. This is by no means an exhaustive list. There are so many different ways that you can make your podcast entertaining. I would challenge you to come up with something that I did not include in this list, something that I overlooked, that is either a way that you are making your content more entertaining or something that you've heard another podcaster do that you think is genius. And if you do find something or think of something, I would love for you to send me an email, Andrea@thecreativeimposter.com, or you can DM me on LinkedIn, or you can record a voice memo on your phone or on your fancy podcasting equipment and send it to me through email, Andrea@thecreativeimposter.com. And if you do send it to me as a voice memo, I can play it on a future episode. I would love to know how you or other podcasters are making your podcast or their podcasts more entertaining. All right, I have been recording for a super long time, but what I do want to close with is that as you're listening to all of these different strategies for making your podcast entertaining, you may be like, oh my God, I'm exhausted. I'm never going to make another podcast episode again as long as I live, because you're telling me that I need to be funny and I need to write stories and I need to start doing sound design and I need to like be incorporating more music into my episodes and it's too much. Like I can't do all of that stuff in my podcasts. I'll never get them done. Well, not necessarily. You don't have to do all of them. And in fact, you're probably already doing some of them. So the key is that it's all about two people, your listener and you. Those are the only two people that matter in this equation, your listener and you. So step one is knowing your listener. As I mentioned, knowing what your listener needs, knowing what they're experiencing, knowing what they're going through, knowing where they are in whatever journey it is that you're accompanying them and guiding them on. And then finding ways to connect to your listener. Does your listener appreciate humor? Does your listener want stories, or do they just want the facts, ma'am? I don't know. Who wants just the facts? Does anybody want just the facts? Knowing what it is that your listener needs and wants, how your listener thinks, the more you know about your listener, the more you'll be able to make these decisions. And then the second person is you doing what is authentic to you. If humor does not come naturally to you, this may not be the tactic that you want to use. When I was a young soul, I was always doing music and theater and performance. And I always wanted to be the ingenue. The ingenue is like the female lead who usually has a soprano voice, like a higher register voice, and usually is the more serious character, the more serious role, and is maybe the primary love interest in the show. And that was always what I aspired to be when I was auditioning, when I was selecting the songs that I wanted to work on. And one day, a coach or a teacher said to me, you know, you're really funny. And I was so irritated. I wasn't trying to be funny. I didn't want to be funny. I wanted to be serious. I wanted to be dramatic. I didn't want to be funny. And what I realized is that once I leaned into that like natural thing that they saw, I started having more success in my auditions. I started getting cast more, and people started really taking notice of the work that I was doing as a performer. So that was an example of finding what came naturally to me and leaning into it. So that's why I say this is also about you. Are you a natural storyteller? Are you really crafty when it comes to gamification? Are you somebody who either has an editor that you can inspire to add some audio texture into your episodes, or are you editing your own show and you can find some ways to add some audio texture? Where is your skill set? What comes naturally to you? And then that is where you can lean into your own particular brand or style of entertainment. And you've got to use that authenticity as your compass when you're making these decisions. I'll play another short clip from one of our clients who I mentioned before, Andrea Fellows-Feinberg, the host and producer of Key Change with the Santa Fe Opera. And this is from the episode called Competing Interests: How to Workshop a New Opera. And of course, she's talking about opera, but this applies to you as well. So listen up.
And then you bring in the audience. And that's the element you really can't control. If you try to play a piece for laughs or forced sentimentality, your audience will know.
So your audience will sniff you out if you're being fakey fake. And I know that some of my way of delivering this content, some of the way that I use my voice, some of the way that I structure things, some of the way that I say things, the way that I include humor, it may seem over the top, but it's still coming from an authentic aspect of my persona. It still feels natural and authentic to me. And therefore, that's why it is not coming across as fakey fake. At least I don't think it is. So there you have it. The two ways to decide which of these strategies to incorporate into your show and to be intentional about is to know your audience and know yourself. In the next full episode of Podcast Envy, we are going to be taking a deep dive into you, yes, you, as the podcast host and developing your skills. This is a good one because, again, this is one of those things that people who start a podcast, they don't feel like hosting is the place that they need to put their time and attention. They think that it has to do with tech or marketing or audience growth or monetization. But really, there is a lot of skill that goes into being an effective and entertaining podcast host, whether you're doing solos, narrative storytelling, or interviews. It doesn't matter. There's skills. And Karen Yates from Wild and Sublime and I are going to talk all about it with you. Podcast Envy is produced by your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. That's me. The Podcast Envy theme music is by Valentin Sosnitsky, courtesy of the Free Sound Project at freesound.org, and our podcast Angel music is by Benjamin Mastropolito, also on freesound.org as Lemon Cream. All music is licensed under the Creative Commons. Our episodes are mixed by Edwin Ruiz, and hey, if you want your show to sound as good as ours, hire us. Put the magic audio mojo of the Creative Imposter Studios to work for you. Thanks so much for listening, and here's to making your podcast the envy of everyone else.